Good morning. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. Dondi Johnson Sr., Jeffrey Alston. For many of you, this may be the first time that you've heard of either of them. The mention of their names didn't elicit any particular thoughts or ideas. You can't necessarily summon an image of their faces or any of the details of their lives. But if I said a name to you that is different, this name, Freddie Gray, now your neurons are firing, making millions of connections in your mind between the name of this one man and all that his name has come to signify. Now you're thinking about the image of a young man in a red T-shirt, squinting slightly against the sun shining on his face. Now you're thinking about police violence. Now you're thinking about the worth of black lives. Now you're thinking about Baltimore and Ferguson and Staten Island and Cleveland. Now you are thinking about other names like Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, all sparked by the mention of that one. But the circumstances that led to the end of Freddie Gray's life are the same as those that forever changed the lives of those whose names we don't know. Dondi Johnson Sr. was paralyzed following a 2005 police van ride, and he later died of pneumonia caused by his paralysis. His family won a $7.4 million verdict against the police. In 2004, a jury awarded Jeffrey Alston $39 million after he emerged from a police van paralyzed from the neck down. All three are African-American men who were seriously injured after a ride in the back of a Baltimore police wagon, and all of their lives have inherent value. But the difference in the layers of meaning and understanding instantly triggered when we hear the name Freddie Gray. Our immediate response to the question famously posed by William Shakespeare, "What's in a name?" That is the difference a movement makes. The movement that the New York Times Magazine this week recognized as the most formidable American protest movement of the 21st century to date. Now, certainly, the Ferguson Police Department drew heightened media scrutiny to the issue of police violence with its militarized response to the anguish of Ferguson's community reacting to the death of Mike Brown. And there is no question that the ubiquity of cell phones enabled with cameras and individual citizens willing to use them to record the police have exposed the nation's police practices that have been commonplace in some communities for years. But our recognition of the names of the dead as a call that demands a response, that the police who protect us are not immune from committing injustices against us, the expectation that our government bears some responsibility for finding a solution to a problem it has been complicit in causing, all of that is the result of the sustained, focused, and organized work of a movement. And it's a movement that over the last 2 years has been propelled by youth-driven grassroots activism. Young people who amplified the anger, outrage, and frustration of individuals and communities into a national campaign for social justice. In the bones of this movement, we can see some of the DNA of the definitive freedom struggle of the previous century. Radicalized young people played essential roles in the civil rights movement's most pivotal campaigns. And the movement to end police violence has also borrowed at least one page from the strategy book of their predecessors. Both have used video images to highlight the vulnerability of black bodies and expose injustices against black lives. But this modern-day movement is also something separate and apart from what came before. It took weeks of planning and strategizing to engineer the decisive moment on the Edmund Pettus Bridge during the Selma voting rights campaign. And it took television news cameras and broadcasts to bring the violence against the protesters to national attention. But today's activists send their own images of police aggression towards peaceful protesters to hundreds of thousands of computers and cell phones and tablet screens with the push of a button. Twitter and text are their tools for organizing and communicating about protest action on the ground as it happens. And unlike the icons who emerge as the face and voice of the movement for civil rights, the young people calling for an end to police violence today pride themselves on being a leaderless movement in which many voices are raised as one. It is what the New York Times Magazine characterized as a communal expression of pent-up anguish spilling onto the streets. This week, the magazine profiled two of the people who, while they reject the title of leaders, are recognized as key organizers and chroniclers of the movement. Janetta Elzie, a St. Louis native, began protesting in Ferguson the day Michael Brown was killed, using social media to give a first-hand account of what she witnessed. DeRay McKesson was a public school administrator who traveled to Ferguson from Minneapolis and was tear-gassed by police while participating in a peaceful protest. But the diffuse nature of this particular protest movement means its stewardship rests in the hands of many activists who are all coordinating and coalescing around a common cause. There are names like Alicia Garza, Pertice Coulars, Opal Tometi, queer feminists of color who gave the movement its rallying cry when they first proclaimed that Black Lives Matter. Charlene Carruthers, the Black Youth Project, a Chicago-based collective using nonviolent direct action to confront the criminalization of African-American youth. Philip Agnew and the Dream Defenders, who long before Ferguson launched the protest against police violence, organized against Florida's Stand Your Ground law in the wake of the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. All of them joined by many others in cities around the country whose names we may never know, but whose work we can see in the response to their calls for justice. Federal investigations into police departments in 2 cities where the movement has focused its protest against police violence. Increased transparency when police are conducting use of force investigations after a citizen has died at the hands of an officer. Criminal charges brought against 6 officers involved in the death of Freddie Gray. An FBI director acknowledging the racialized tensions between law enforcement and some of the communities they police. All of this in the wake of and in response to a movement that has made it possible for us to see the names of lives that have been lost without considering their claim that those lives do matter. Joining me now is one of the members of the movement profiled in the New York Times Magazine, DeRay McKesson, who's co-founder of WeTheProtesters.org. DeRay, nice to have you.
Nice to be here.
And you're on the phone even as we are speaking, in part because clearly part of what you all do as organizers, as chroniclers, is to walk so many of us who are not there in the cities, in the streets with you, through what is happening. How important is that technology to the work that you're doing?
It's huge. You know, as people of color, we've always faced issues of erasure. Either our stories have never been told or they've been told by everybody but us. And Twitter allowed us to take that back. We could tell our stories, excuse me, in real time. I think about Missouri. Missouri would have convinced you that we did not exist if it had not been for Twitter. Because we could come together, we could push back on these narratives in ways that were really powerful, and we can continue to tell our own stories.
So talk to me about the idea that this is a movement, because I think for more than 50 years, or for at least 50 years, I think there's been a kind of insistence and unwillingness to describe social action and unrest as a movement because it wants to keep sacred some particular narrative of a movement that exists in the 1960s. So when you see the kind of all the news that's fit to print, New York Times declaring this a movement, what does that mean?
It is a movement. I think what's hard for people is that the origin story, the beginning is just so different, right? Is that this started because people came outside of their houses and said no more. There was no Martin, there was no Malcolm, there was no SNCC, there was no SCLC. It is people who made this space happen. You know, today's a 275th day of protest, and the movement is growing, continuing. What's been really interesting is that people across the country, across socioeconomic statuses, across race, can now have a conversation about what's happening in race and policing in ways that have never happened before.
So it's interesting even hearing you say that. I wonder if that is as much, the distinction you just made there, I wonder if that is as much a kind of lack of understanding of also what happened in the civil rights movement, which was in so many ways also made by the people, with Martin and SNCC and all of those organizations coming later. One of my favorite stories that is told about you in this piece is you talking with Diane Nash, in part because Diane Nash is everything and remains everything. But the idea of you saying to her, Ms. Nash, Twitter is the movement. What do you mean when you say that to Diane Nash?
You know, Diane Nash is great, and she said to us, she was like, you know, you need to do it your way. She said to the movement, she was like, if she had taken the advice of all the older people who talked to her, she never would have taken those risks with the freedom rides, any of that stuff. What we're saying to her is that we can actually just come together differently. So we can spread a message quicker than they ever could back then. And that's what we talk about when we say Twitter's a movement, is this idea that at the heart of revolution has always been the well-told story. And for the first time, as people of color, we get to own the way we tell the story.
Stop for me for a second, because I think for some people, the idea of being a movement organizer is just, what does that mean to say I'm a movement organizer? You were working a job that was an identifiable job that people would, you're in the schools, you're a school administrator, you're a teacher. Those are good jobs that people strive to have. So talk to me about the decision to move away from that and into this more nebulous space of organizing.
Yeah, you know, Mike got killed on August 9th. On August 16th, I was sitting on my couch and I was like, this looks crazy on Twitter. And I got in the car, drove 9 hours to St. Louis, didn't know anybody, put on Facebook I was going, and that like began my time in protest. And I'll never forget getting tear gassed the first time. And it was this moment of like, this is not the America I know, right? Like this just isn't what I thought America was. And when I made the decision to eventually quit on March 6th, it was this thing about like, I could do all this cool work, finding teachers, developing human capital systems. But if kids like never make it to the next grade, then what am I doing, right? Like you got to be alive to learn. And that was sort of what did it. I've never felt more covered and sort of doing the right work than what I do now. And this has been about like empowering people through information to act in ways that are new.
I wanted to ask you what you think you have achieved, not you personally, but what has this movement at this point? It's not done. It's maybe in some ways just getting started. But what has been achieved thus far?
It's a good question. In the beginning, I think it was about like confronting and disrupting, right? It was this notion that you can actually like push back on the state in a way that is meaningful, that you can confront the state that is killing people. I think what then happened is like this community building phase that literally people are coming together in ways that are unprecedented in blackness, that there are these communities that are forming around political power that are new. I think that what we're transitioning to now is like this capacity building phase where people are like actually understanding the work and the issues better. And I mean people like broadly. People like middle schoolers, like high school people who normally would not consider themselves activists. And that's like a really disruptive and powerful thing. It is no longer someone who has to have like a title and sit in this office who can like affect change. It is people coming into the street who can confront and disrupt in powerful ways.
You just used the language of blackness, and I want to pause on that for a second. Is that a truly expansive definition of blackness, where blackness comes to stand in for social marginality, rejection, being unequal, or is it a more narrow definition of blackness? And I ask in part because I want to know for whom this movement is. Is it only for people who would self-identify as African American, or is it a movement in which blackness gets defined as all people who find themselves in conflict with the state?
Yeah, good question. So the movement, we believe that like once we achieve sort of freedom or liberation for black people, that everybody wins, right? So in that way, the movement is for everybody. That social justice, in equity, everybody wins. I do think there's this expansive understanding of the diaspora, right? That like people of color are affected in important ways or destructive ways. But this is about black people, right? And we're not afraid to say that Black Lives Matter. And when we say that, we are not affirming our lives. We're exposing the depth of the evil that we face as black people in the context of white supremacy.
You are going to hang out a bit and join me again at the top of the next hour, but I appreciate having a few moments to speak with you here, and the movement's going to continue when we come back.